What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-800-585-9396.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hi, everybody. Welcome again to Call to Communion, the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. We're here to answer those questions that you may have about the Catholic faith, whether you are a non-Catholic or maybe somebody who used to be a Catholic years ago and you've been thinking about coming back in, but you're saying, yeah, you know what? There's this one thing that I really don't understand or that I really don't like. Let's talk about that. 1-800-585-9396 is our number, 1-800-585-9396. Now, if you're calling from outside the U.S. and Canada, your number is 1-205-271-2985. You can also send us an email if you prefer that, ctc@ewtn.com. Rich Jesse is our producer, Matt Kabinski handling the phones. Jeff Burson is doing our social media today. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very good. Had some kind of rough news this weekend about Father Mitch.
Oh, no.
Yes, indeed. Father Mitch suffered a heart attack on Saturday evening.
This is the first I've heard of it. Oh, my gosh.
Wow. Well, you must not be on. Oh, that's right. You were on a canoe trip all weekend.
I was canoeing down the Cahaba River this weekend.
Well, this actually happened Saturday evening. Father Mitch had a heart attack. He has responded very well to the angioplasty that was done on Saturday night. Apparently, they caught it very early. In typical Father Mitch fashion, he said, apparently heaven doesn't want me, and hell is afraid I will take over. So please keep Father Mitch in your prayers as he continues his recovery. He's probably going to be out for a week or so.
Well, everybody please pray for Father Mitch.
Yeah, an amazing man.
Lord have mercy on him. I didn't know that, so
yep.
I'm glad.
Yep. So that's the deal. On the heels of our dear friend Jack Williams losing his wife Susie last week, and the funeral for that will be tomorrow. So, we soldier on here, and sometimes on this program we answer questions about death, and we talk about this because it's all part of the process, right?
Well, I mean, ultimately this is all preparation for the next life.
All of it.
All of it. So it's only in light of eternity that everything we go through in this life makes any sense at all.
Sure. Well, some days we kick off with email, and I'm going to kick off with an email today. This is from Nick in North Dakota, who says, "Greetings. I have an uncle who is mentally handicapped. He was raised in the Catholic Church, just like the rest of the family and I. It's hard to gauge whether he understands his faith or if he's just playing along because that's how he was raised." Again, this is his uncle. "I would like to understand and know how mentally handicapped people attain salvation, even if they don't understand the concepts of our faith, the sacraments, and other things. My uncle does attend Mass with us weekly. I try to bring him into the confession when I have the opportunity, although I think he's just having fun talking to the priest and doesn't really understand the sacrament at all. I obviously don't know what goes on inside the confessional, but I just have that feeling. I do trust in God's mercy and love, especially for those afflicted from birth. However, my father, my uncle's brother, says that people born with disabilities automatically go to heaven. I don't know what to think about that. So anyway, I want to be sure that my uncle receives the proper spiritual instruction and nourishment so that his soul is properly disposed toward sainthood. I don't think it's responsible to assume that he will go to heaven, because that would cause us on earth to ignore caring for him spiritually. So, can you, David, clear up some of this for me, and please give me some advice on how to care for my uncle's spiritual health. God bless you, and thank you for your ministry through your show." Nick in North Dakota.
Nick, thank you. What a beautiful question. I really appreciate that.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, there are a couple things. First of all, your uncle, his uncle, right? His
Yeah,
uncle?
yeah.
Your uncle goes to heaven the same way any of us would go to heaven, which is if he dies in God's friendship with the grace of God in his soul, all right, in sanctifying grace, then he will have, by definition, have merited eternal life, because he'll have the love of God shed abroad in his heart, and it's love that fulfills the law. It's not knowledge that fulfills the law, all right? And so a person can be abysmally ignorant and still have the love of God in their heart and have merited salvation. Now, love comes to us, the grace of God comes to us through faith. Faith is strengthened, confirmed, contextualized, given legs, as it were, through the sacraments. They are the sacraments of faith. That's how the tradition speaks of them. And so baptism conveys to us the grace, the supernatural infusion of the virtue of faith, which is a disposition to believe everything that God has revealed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in an infant has faith. An infant has the theological virtue of faith. They have that supernatural disposition to believe everything that God has revealed in His holy church. But the content of that faith is entirely implicit. All right, the infant doesn't know anything conceptually about the faith at that age, and yet they have that supernatural habit in their soul through the grace of baptism. And that's many of us go through life with a faith that is largely implicit. So, someone who wasn't well catechized, for instance, but has that disposition to believe. They believe what they know of the faith, and much of it they hold just implicitly. They trust the judgment of the church or their catechist or even their parents, and they have the love of God in their soul, and they go to heaven when they die. Right? Some people, through long study and arduous effort, may acquire a very, very explicit and detailed knowledge of the faith. Even those people hold some things implicitly. I've had the benefit of being able to go to theology school and study for many, many years, but all the time I'm learning new things about the faith. Pick up a papal encyclical I've never read before, and really, that's the faith entails that? I didn't realize that. I learned new, but I have the habit, thanks be to God, I have the habit of believing what the church teaches, and so when I learn about a new aspect of the church's doctrine, I habitually accept it. All right, that's what faith means. But some people, don't have that opportunity, and so their faith is implicit. We don't know where that line is drawn in anybody's life about where the limits of their intellectual capacity are. Thankfully, we're not judged by God on the basis of our intellectual capacity, but based on the charity in our souls given to us by grace. So in terms of how do we pastor people, we give them as much of the truth as they're capable of receiving. We also understand that formation in the faith is not just about intellectual knowledge. It's about acquiring supernatural and natural virtues, conforming the pattern of their lives to holiness. Living a life that's morally pure, learning how to curb our anger, learning how to curb our appetites, learning how to be humble. These kinds of things as well are part of faith formation. And there are some disabled people who intellectually challenged excel at many of those virtues far beyond people who have much greater intellectual capacity. I mean, I was blessed one time to work with mentally challenged kids at a summer camp, found people of surpassing holiness, great moral virtue, who had profound disabilities intellectually, but greatly exceeded me in the habits of virtue in their lives.
Thank you so much, Nick, for your email, and we hope that is helpful for you. 10 minutes after the hour, when we come back, we'll kick it off with Doug in St. Louis, also Elizabeth in Hyannis, Mass. Frank is checking in as well. We've got a line open for you, too. 1-800-585-9396. 1-800-585-9396 for Call to Communion here on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-800-585-9396. This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hello, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I just had the pleasure of interviewing Father Christopher Collins, S.J., on his new book, 3 Moments of the Day. You want to give us a synopsis of this book, Father?
It really is uncovering a way of praying in daily life and marks 3 moments. The first being the morning offering, that desire to offer the whole day to the Lord no matter what happens, whether I'm succeeding or failing or whatever it is. I'm united to the heart of Christ. At the end of the day, to do a review, to do an examine of the day, say, how did that gift go in the course of the day? And then the third moment being the Eucharist itself, the liturgy itself, and how is it that's kind of foundational for a way of thinking about all of our lives, our ordinary daily lives.
Mm-hmm. And can this be used, but not only individuals, but by groups in like parishes?
Definitely, yeah. I think it's a helpful. Some that I've talked to have found it a helpful way to kind of both reflect on their own lives, then share that together.
Well, we here at EWTN love the devotion to the Sacred Heart, so thank you so much. Speaking here with Father Christopher Collins. His book is 3 Moments of the Day. Look for the entire interview coming soon to EWTN, and check out the book at EWTNRC.com. And this has been another EWTN Bookmark Brief. Thanks for being with us.
This is Bishop William Medley of the Diocese of Owensboro.
This is Al Cresta, host of Cresta in the Afternoon.
Hi, I'm Archbishop William Laurie, the Archbishop of Baltimore, and you're listening to EWTN Radio.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
If you have a question about the Catholic faith, this is the place to get it answered, especially for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. By golly, we do it 5 days a week right here at 2 p.m. Eastern every day on EWTN Radio. 1-800-585-9396. One line open at the moment. We're going to kick it off here with Doug in St. Louis, listening to EWTN on Covenant Radio. Hey, Doug, what's your question today?
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a friend who is a Lutheran Missouri Synod. He's a very devout man, but he related this story to me last week about he comes from a background of parents and grandparents who were Catholic, but when his parents went to marry, they met with a priest, and his dad relayed the story that he was married right out of high school to another woman, but they were soon divorced, and the priest assured them that that was not going to be a problem for he and his mother getting married. They just need to go through the annulment process. And the dad asked, well, how long would something like that take? And the priest said, well, normally about a year or two, but with a donation to the church, that process can be sped along. And at that point, the dad said that he didn't want anything to do with the Catholic Church anymore because of that kind of thing. And how do I answer stories like this when they come up?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Doug. I really appreciate the question. So, first of all, I know canonists who work on marriage tribunals in the diocese. The ones that I know are people of outstanding integrity, intellectual honesty, virtue, who would never take a bribe in their job, and their goal is to bring truth and light onto very painful situations, and hopefully to bring healing also. So, I mean, their motives are good. So this is not my experience of marriage tribunals.
I've never heard of anybody putting it that particular way. That sounds out of line to me.
Okay. So, so I don't know the particular context here, and obviously we're far removed in years, and so there's no way to go and investigate. It's possible that what the father heard is different from what the priest said. All right? But let's put the worst possible spin on it and assume that there is outright corruption. And maybe that's not the case, but let's just assume there's outright corruption. So here's a cleric who's actually trying to solicit money to speed along a canonical process whose outcome has already sort of been promised in advance, which he shouldn't do, of course. Right? That is wrong, because that's the job of the tribunal to render the verdict, not for some priest to sort of preempt that judgment on his own authority. Let's assume that is the case. Well, is there no corruption in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church? Have there never been corrupt clerics in the Missouri Synod? Luther wouldn't have said so. All right. Luther would be the first person to tell you that clerics and canonists and church officials have the capacity for corruption. In fact, he was rather famous for teaching that corruption ran so deeply that it was ineradicable. All right. And Luther was emphatic that he did not leave the Catholic Church because of corruption. He never made the claim that because he knew any new church that started would have corruption intrinsic to it because of the human condition.
Of course.
And we go back in Scripture and we look at this. We see, of course, there have always been clerics and people in authority in the church in the New Testament era who were corrupt in one way or another. And one of my favorite instances comes to us from the book of 3 John. You know, you wonder sometimes, why did God put that book in the Bible? It's like about 2 inches long. You know, what does it teach? But we find this story about a bishop named Diotrephes. And St. John says, I've written something to the church But Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge my authority. So in other words, here's the evangelist, the apostle, who's written like a circular letter, an encyclical, if you will, and Diotrephes won't read it in the church. All right, he doesn't acknowledge my authority. So if I come, I'll bring up what he's doing, prating against me with evil words. And not content with that, he refuses himself to welcome brethren and also stops those who want to welcome them and puts them out of the church. So we read, even in the era of the apostles, all right, about corrupt bishops and clergy in antiquity who wouldn't even acknowledge apostolic authority. And we know Paul had to contend all the time for his right actually to speak authoritatively into the life of local churches. Corinth was eaten up with all kinds of corruption and abuse that was far worse than simony, the buying and selling of spiritual goods. It actually included sexual immorality, all kinds of nastiness going on. And, of course, even in the circle of the disciples. I mean, there's Judas. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Who was pretty big on taking donations to, all right. So, anyway, all that is to say, none of that on the face even addresses the key issues of disagreement between Lutherans and Catholics, which is, number one issue is, which is the church that Christ founded? All right. And once we identify that, we're going to find within it, as Jesus told us we would, saints and sinners.
Yep.
All right. And does the church actually do its job? What is its job description? It's to bring people to holiness. All right. Does that happen? Yes, it does. All right. In every age, the Catholic Church brings people to sanctity, sometimes heroic sanctity. The fact that it fails to bring every single member to heroic sanctity is no fault against its divine authority, because people have free will. They can choose not to cooperate with grace.
Yeah. Is that helpful for you, Doug?
Yeah, it does, because oftentimes I hear people saying that, there's this deep corruption in the church, and that's such a problem. And I guess it's maybe because the church is supposed to be held to such a high level that any kind of corruption seen in the church is seen as proof of its invalidity or
Right, exactly. And you think about that. I mean, so of course there's corruption in the church.
Sure.
Of course there is. Jesus told us there would be. I mean, the disciples said, what do we do with corruption? He said, we'll leave them until the end of the age. The tares and the wheat. The angels will sort this out at the end of time. Christ, the body of Christ, the church that Christ established, is a mixed body. It includes sinners and saints and people all along the continuum between holiness and vice.
Yep.
And that if it were any other way, we've tried that in history. Puritanism was a wonderful example of a religious experiment to found the church on visible saints. And that was the idea. All right. Donatism in the 4th century in North Africa, another example of an attempt to found the church on visible saints. What happens when you actually attempt to put that into practice institutionally? Lots of hypocrisy. Really, really fast. And then immediately schisms over who is and isn't holy. A great book on this by, I think her name's Janice Knight. It's called Orthodoxies in Massachusetts, about the Puritan experiment in New England. As soon as they came over here thinking, hey, we're finally going to have a pure church and founded on this model of visible sanctity, as soon as they stepped off the Mayflower, they split into factions, and Puritanism in North America went in 1,000 different directions, with everybody anathematizing each other for their lack of holiness.
What a mess.
And doctrinal deviation.
Yeah. Doug, thank you so much for your call. Our phone number, 1-800-585-9396. 2 lines open right now. 1-800-585-9396. We're going to Hyannis, Mass. and talk with Elizabeth, listening to EWTN Radio on YouTube right now, probably checking us out visually. Hey there, Elizabeth. What's your question today?
Hey, guys. Thanks so much for taking my call.
Sure.
I love your show.
Thank you.
And I'm learning a lot. I'm a revert. So I'm back home and very happy to be. My question, or more of a statement today, is I just wanted to visit the subject of premarital sex and the church's teaching. I recently was on a Catholic dating site, and I was horrified, to be honest with you. It's like 95% of these men, it lists, like, where do you line up with the church's teaching, and it lists each thing, papal infallibility, contraception, premarital sex. And I'm telling you, 95% of these men do not agree with the church's teaching on premarital sex and contraception. Makes sense. If you're going to be having sex outside of marriage, you're going to not agree with the contraception rule either. So just very disheartening. And, I got off the site because I was like, well, obviously I'm not going to find the right guy here. So I just felt like maybe my brothers in Christ just need a reminder that it's not a buffet. When we're Catholic, we line up with the church, and we trust the teachings that are there to protect us. And so I guess it was just, I don't know, I just felt like maybe you could remind them what the church says about premarital sex.
What an excellent call.
I appreciate that, Elizabeth, a lot. And
Thank you.
I'm sorry for the dynamic that you've put your finger on. There is an enormous difference between sexual relations outside of marriage and sexual relations within marriage, because marriage is a bond created by a promise of lifelong fidelity until death, no matter what comes, through sickness and in health, for better or for worse. All right. So you can completely and totally rely on me if I'm married to you. If my wife can rely on me to death, no matter what, because I've made a solemn promise in the sight of God. All right. So that also includes fully accepting the responsibility of parenthood. And parenthood does tend to follow sexual activity. That's the general pattern, right? So someone who is having sexual relations without that promise of lifelong fidelity has not taken up the responsibility of parenthood, if it follows, which it more than likely will from sexual activity, and has not made themselves reliable, hasn't said to the other person, you can rely on me. In effect, almost all consensual sex outside of marriage is, you can rely on me for as long as I feel like it. And as soon as I want to get out of here, I'm out of here. I mean, that's what lacking that promise of fidelity means.
Yeah.
I don't promise to be with you forever. So I will be with you as long as it's pleasurable or satisfying or interesting or easy, but under no other circumstances. Yeah. So you will sometimes hear people say, well, we love each other. Why can't we just do this? But love is the willingness to sacrifice for another human being. All right? And the ultimate example is Christ, who laid down his life for the salvation of his bride, the church. That's the model of Christian holiness presented to us in Ephesians chapter 5 about Christian marriage. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her a holy church, a pure church, sanctified, without spot or wrinkle or any other blemish. That's what the text says. All right. So a couple that's not willing to bind themselves by a promise of marriage cannot possibly say, I love you, because love means the willingness to give up my own interests. Unless I have sacrificed my freedom to this other person forever, then I don't really love them. I love them, quote unquote, love them conditionally, conditional on my satisfaction, my personal pleasure, or whatever else it might be. Right? So it's the opposite of love. It's selfishness. I want to take advantage of this for whatever benefit I may perceive in the short run. So that's the reason why the church insists that that sexual relations outside of marriage are unlawful. But add to that the teaching of divine revelation. I mean, St. Paul only contemplates two possibilities. He says it's better to be like me, like St. Paul, perfectly continent and celibate, so you can give yourself to the work of the Lord. But it's better to marry than to burn with passion. So the only outlet for that, lawfully, is marriage. All right, that's what St. Paul tells us. And then, of course, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, as well as the 2,000-year-old tradition of the Church, teaches that there's only one lawful outlet for the sexual gratification of the sexual urge, and that's marriage. And even within marriage, it's not anything goes. It's not, once I pass beyond that boundary of marriage, now I can do whatever I like sexually. Married people are also called to chastity, which takes a very particular form. And Pope Francis, interestingly, states this very bluntly in his recent apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, where he says that he's very specific. And if I can use, the language that he uses, he says, no genital act in a marriage can deflect from the intrinsic ordering of sexuality towards procreation, i.e., no contraception allowable. And he states 3 or 4 times in the letter, we have to go back to the message of Humana Vitae, we have to go back to Humana Vitae, we have to go back to Humana Vitae, which of course was Paul VI, reaffirming the 2,000-year-old tradition of the Church that human sexuality is ordered to procreation, period, end of paragraph.
Elizabeth, thank you for your call today, and thank you for checking us out on YouTube. And I would also say this to you specifically, and to anybody checking us out today, there is a big difference between Catholic websites, between dating sites. So just because the word Catholic is in there doesn't mean it is totally what you're looking for. And so we will talk about that a little more after the break. This is Called to Communion here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Radio Network. Back in just 2 minutes. Don't go away.
Hey, Catholic high school and college filmmakers. Want to get your work seen in over 250 million homes around the world? Then enter the Cool to be Catholic commercial contest. We're looking for original 30 and 60-second spots that focus on Catholic themes. 3 grand prize winners will get an all-expense-paid trip to the EWTN studios in Birmingham, Alabama, and a guest appearance on Life on the Rock. To find out more and to enter, go to EWTN.com/cool2becatholic.
At St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, Pope Francis said, "We have to ask ourselves, are we even capable of counting our blessings? If we don't take time to count our blessings, we forget that they're there. Sadly, we tend to do this with the greatest blessings in life. Sure, we thank the person behind the counter who just handed us our change, but when's the last time you told someone that you treasure the gift of his friendship? As silly as it sounds, have you thanked your kids for letting you be their dad? Do you thank your spouse for the gift of her life? Married people can often feel lonely because they get so used to each other that they almost forget that they're not alone. Friends, family, a good meal, a pretty sunset. These are the things that make us super lotto winners. Be sure to cash in. Take a few minutes every day to stop, notice your blessings, and thank God for them. That's where gratitude begins, and joy is never far behind. This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com on EWTN Radio.
I invite people to listen to Women of Grace Live if they're interested in being informed, if they're interested in being inspired, if they're interested in being encouraged in their life of faith. I encourage people to listen to Women of Grace Live because we hear from a wide assortment of people whose questions oftentimes are the very questions that are going on. I'm Janet Benkovic, inviting you to join me weekday mornings at 11 Eastern for Women of Grace on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
Tonight on The Journey Home with Marcus Grodi, Marcus welcomes Michael Kress. He is a former member of the Church of God, an agnostic, an Episcopal. He's been all sorts of things. He's a happy Catholic now. Check the program out tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN television. Before the break, we were talking about Catholic dating sites, Catholic websites, and as what I was starting to say is that they're not all created equal just because they may have the word Catholic in the title somewhere or in their mission statement. And I'm not going to name names or anything like that. I'm just going to say, do some homework. Ask your friends. I have a number of friends who are now very happily married through Catholic dating sites, and so I know that there are some very good ones out there. And David, you were about to point something out.
Yes, a fortiori, what applies to Catholic dating sites applies to Catholic colleges, Catholic newspapers. Just because the name Catholic is appended at the top doesn't mean that the directors of that institution have any interest in maintaining fidelity to Catholic teaching.
Let the buyer beware.
Right.
There you go. 30 after the hour. Let's go back to the phones and talk with Debbie in New Hampshire, listening to EWTN Radio on the Station of the Cross. Hey there, Debbie. What's your question today?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much. I have learned so much from listening to you and from Catholic Radio, so thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yes. So I have been a lifelong Protestant, and about 4 years ago, really became interested in the Catholic Church. And after reading a million books and really studying and praying, I wanted to convert to Catholicism. I went ahead and got my little daughter baptized in the church. And the thing is, I was married, 25 years ago, right out of high school. That marriage ended. That person was never baptized or anything like that, but we were married in a church. And so I was told that I would have to have an annulment. And my husband now, of many, many years, that he would have to have an annulment too, although he was the one who was left and didn't want the divorce. So my husband is so gracious. He said that he would go through all of this for me because it is so important to me that I become Catholic. But after all of that, I was told that our marriages might not even be able to be annulled, and I was a little surprised by that. I guess I thought that if you really did all of the work and you really researched everything, and it was, 20 years ago, that that it would kind of, I guess I just misunderstood. I thought it would be a given, and I guess that's not correct. Am I understanding that correctly?
All right, let me thank you so much, Debbie. I really appreciate it. And this is not an insuperable barrier to your becoming Catholic, okay? But let me first of all explain the Church's teaching on marriage and what an annulment is to help you understand the background about why one would or would not be granted. Jesus, as you know, in Matthew chapter 19, was asked about whether it was lawful to divorce, and he said categorically, no, it's not lawful. What God has joined together, let man not separate. And the disciples thought that was pretty unreasonable, and they said that it's better not to marry if that's the case. And Christ didn't dissuade them from that conclusion. He said, this can be done with the help of grace. To whom God gives, this is possible. So marriage is indissoluble by definition, period, end of paragraph, without exception. If you're married, can dissolve a valid marriage, whether or not it's a sacramental marriage. All right, so even a natural marriage is naturally ordered toward indissolubility. I mean, it's something derived from the natural law, the nature of parenthood, the kind of commitment that's needed to be made in order to raise a family. It's not just something specific to Christian marriage. All right, and so sometimes it happens that people contract what they think is a marriage, and they find out after the fact that there was something seriously lacking in the form or intent of that union, so that what they thought was a marriage actually is not a marriage. And that it's fairly common, all right? And so there are a number of things that would be just no-brainers to be a defeater, all right? A good example would be a prenuptial agreement. Somebody makes a prenuptial agreement, they're contemplating the possibility of separation. Well, marriage is a promise of lifelong conjugal fidelity. Yeah. All right. If you contemplate not doing that, then you're not actually whatever your words are, you mean something different by marriage than what the Church means. Yeah. Another sort of no-brainer would be people who supposedly contract marriage, but intend not to have children. Well, marriage is for the procreation of children. That's its natural end. If you don't intend that, then you intend something other than what the Church means by marriage. Another very common reason that someone might not actually validly contract marriage would be you're nuts. All right, you don't actually have the psychological faculties to take on that kind of responsibility, which is why there are laws about also immaturity. Someone who's below the age of consent, for instance, is not really morally or psychologically capable of contracting those kinds of obligations, and the psychological impairment is the one that's most obviously brought forth, and this is common in people who, because of social, societal, whatever sort of pressure it is, right out of high school, they jump into something with somebody they barely know. They don't really know what they're getting involved in, and they may say the words, but they can't possibly understand what they're committing themselves to. And under investigation, that becomes pretty patently obvious. So they didn't really commit themselves to the full demands of Christian marriage. But if you do contract a valid Christian marriage and know what you're getting yourself in for, then obviously, by definition, that can never be dissolved. So an annulment is not Catholic divorce. It's not dissolving a marriage. It's declaring that a marriage was never there to begin with. Okay. Now, so when you submit your case to a marriage tribunal, you're not seeking a divorce. What you're doing is you're asking the marriage tribunal to judge the legitimacy of those previous unions, and then being willing to live with that judgment. All right. So it's a fact-finding mission. It's just like a jury. A jury's job is to determine the truth. Whether this person was guilty or innocent, whether the plaintiff was, whether the defendant was liable or not. In this case, whether a marriage existed or it didn't. All right. That is number one job, is to attain the truth of the matter, the facts of the matter. Now, I don't know the particulars of your case. All right. But from what you've told me, obviously, I can imagine right now that there would be grounds for an annulment based on youth, inexperience, ignorance of the faith, ignorance perhaps about what marriage entailed, all kinds of mitigating factors that could come in there. But you are surrendering, if you believe the church, all right, you are surrendering yourself to the judgment of the church. And it is theoretically possible they could return a negative judgment. Do I think it's likely? No, actually, I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. And part of submitting to the church, when you come up to the point of actually converting, you're going to say, I believe everything that Catholic Church declares to be revealed by God. Most people have at least one thing in the Catholic faith they find hard to swallow. And I've actually known people that have said, well, I'd become Catholic if I could just reserve my assent on this one thing.
That's why we do this show.
Right. And it's kind of like somebody saying, well, I'd love to become a Christian if I could just throw out, say, the book of Proverbs. I don't like Proverbs. Everything else in the Bible I'll take, but not Proverbs. All right.
Yeah.
No, if we really believe this is a divine authority established by Christ, then assenting to 99% of what the church teaches is not assenting at all.
Yeah.
It's like promising the fidelity of marriage 6 days a week, and not 1 day a week. No,
Yeah.
but hey, take heart, okay? Because they're not there to make your life difficult. They're there to help you move towards holiness. I mean, the law of the church is there for the salvation of souls. So even if they return to negative judgment, that doesn't mean there's no path for you to become Catholic. It just means the path becomes objectively really difficult. And I'm not going to shy away from that. It could be very hard for you in terms of the personal sacrifices you might be called to make. But there is literally nothing that can ultimately stop you from becoming a Catholic, except your own desire not to become one, because the barriers to overcome seem pretty serious.
Is that helpful for you, Debbie?
It really is helpful. I guess that I was just so sad, to think. I don't know. I mean, I desire it so much, and I go to church, and
Sure.
I see people take communion, and sometimes it breaks my heart. And then I work with people who are Catholic, and some of them are very devout, and some of them are like, oh yeah, I'm a cafeteria Catholic, and I don't believe that, and I haven't been to communion in years. And I'm
Wow.
like, what a treasure! How can you? It's like passing up
Debbie, I'll tell you
the
right
most
now,
beautiful
you're
thing
going
in
to
the
meet
world.
Catholics. You're going to meet Catholics that will advise you to say or do whatever you want to do. All right, but you can't do that because you'll be acting against your own conscience, and you've already seen that. You've seen some that say you need to do what the church says, and others that say, whatever you want to do. But at the end of the day, this is a matter of conscience for you, and nothing can compare to the peace of conscience.
Yeah. Debbie, appreciate your call. 39 after the hour. We're going to take one more break, and we'll talk with George in Charleston, South Carolina when we come back. Also, Joan in Kansas City, Mike in Chicago, all coming up here on this edition of Call to Communion on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-800-585-9396. This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
I'm Raymond Arroyo with Mother Angelica, A Remarkable Life. I'm in the cloister yard at Sancta Clara. This is the monastery where Mother Angelica spent her young religious life. In 1953, the abbess here, Mother Clare, turned to Sister Angelica and asked her to provide spiritual instruction to the novices, the young sisters. Sister Angelica consented, but because this was a violation of community rules, Sister Angelica did so on the sly. She met with the novices in the woodshed or in the nearby gazebo and continued to provide spiritual leadership that would continue throughout her religious life. Stay with EWTN as we continue to celebrate the life and legacy of Mother Angelica.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-800-585-9396.
41 after the hour. I loved hearing Raymond tell these stories about Mother Angelica and her early life. I just think they're awesome. Tomorrow night, Mother Angelica Live Classics. One of the great ones, Mother talks about the Our Father. She's going to explain it word by word, and you will really enjoy this. Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN television. Before we go back to the phones, I want to answer a quick question here from Bernie from Swaziland, Africa, checking us out today on YouTube. He says, do we have historical proof that someone who was not Jewish became one of Christ's followers before the resurrection?
Well, sure. I'm thinking about Matthew 15, the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Christ and says even the dogs feed on the crumbs that fall from the master's table. There are a number of Gentiles that and Samaritans that Christ encounters. Think about John chapter 4, where we learn about the Samaritan at the well, and who was not only a historical person, but also a typology for all of the Gentile and non-Jewish believers that would believe in Christ. And we know from the account that Jesus not only spoke to her, but he spoke to all the villagers that knew her. And we're told explicitly that they became believers, not only because of her testimony, because they met Jesus directly. Roman centurion, Roman centurion whose servant he healed, and so on. So there are a lot of Gentiles, Roman, Syrophoenicians, Samaritans that Christ interacted with, although the thrust of his ministry was towards the Jews of Judea in Galilee, and he tells us that explicitly. I was called to the lost sheep of Israel, and it was left to the apostles, especially St. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, to spread the message of salvation to the wider world.
Appreciate that you're checking us out today in Swaziland, Bernie. I'm glad you're watching us today on YouTube. 43 after the hour, let us go to Mike in Chicago, listening to EWTN on our very own app. Hey there, Mike. What's your question today?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank
Hello.
you for taking my call.
Sure.
I just found out recently that my wife, who is not Catholic, I am a revert, is going to be filing for divorce. And my lawyer, I guess, is pushing me in the direction of, I don't know if the terminology is correct, but filing also for divorce. And I'm concerned about my standing in the church. If she files for divorce and I don't, or if she does and I follow suit, I don't really know what the proper terminology is. But I have not asked for a divorce. Been married 38 years. We're married in a Catholic church. Again, my wife is not Catholic, so I need some advice.
Okay, all right. I am so sorry. I am really, really sorry that you're going to have to go through this. My heart is moved. Okay, a couple of things. First of all, you don't desire this divorce, and so you're not morally responsible for the filing of the divorce. Okay, I mean that's her act, and you're not responsible for that. I'm sure everybody has things that they're sorry that they've done in the past, but we're talking about this particular thing right here. She's filing, not you. You're not responsible. There are we under normal circumstances, married couples have a moral obligation to live together, to live under one roof, the obligation to maintain conjugal living. And so on the face of it, I think it's morally problematic to engage in a kind of preemptive divorce filing, all right, because you want to do everything you possibly can to preserve the marriage, not to end it. Now, we're getting into thorny ground here that is honestly beyond my legal knowledge, both canonical and civil. So I don't know what kinds of actions you could take legally to protect yourself. I think you're perfectly within your bounds, within your rights, to try to protect yourself legally. Divorce courts are not necessarily bastions of justice, and husbands or wives, for that matter, can be taken advantage of in divorce proceedings. So it's a good idea to have an attorney and try to make sure that truth and justice are done here. And then, of course, morally, if the divorce is finalized, you can't run out and contract another marriage. You can't go out and marry somebody else because you're not divorced in the eyes of God. You're just civilly divorced. Unless you know of some reason that the marriage wouldn't have been considered valid by the church in advance. And this is a really difficult thing. Now, in terms of, how far can you go in terms of legal proceedings to protect yourself, financially in other ways? Now, there's so many thorny questions there. I think it would be a good idea to contact someone in your diocese, who's a canon lawyer, who's also knowledgeable in moral theology, because we're going to have to draw some fine distinctions here, and I could get myself in trouble fast if I start giving out legal advice.
Sure.
But we want to preserve the union rather than sever it. That's principle number one. You're not at fault. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of preemptive divorce, all right, because you don't have the grounds, unless you're in moral or spiritual danger immediately. You don't have the grounds that would allow civil divorce to be moral, all right. But there's an awful lot you should probably do to protect yourself.
Mike, we appreciate your call, and we will certainly keep you in prayer. 47 after the hour. Let's go to George in Charleston, South Carolina, listening to EWTN Radio on Sirius XM 130. George, what's your question today?
Hey, guys. Just real quickly, I've been a convert for 13 years, still have a lot of Protestant family members, and, I've enjoyed the fullness of the faith, unlike growing up in another denomination. Really have seen a lot that's opened my eyes over the last 13 years. But, the subject still comes up sometimes with family members that are different denominations. But, my question is, when it comes to the differences in the church teaching, and the two that come up in particular are contraception and in vitro fertilization. And I understand the church's teachings on that, but, Protestant family members don't. And, they look to me and say, well, what does that mean for you? If you do this, well, I'm not in the state of sanctifying grace and need to confess my sins and so forth. And, but for them, there's nothing that is preventing them from, keeping that lifestyle, so to speak. And I just want to see, there's other particulars in the faith or differences that I see that one puts me in a state of, not a state of sanctifying grace, and they're okay. And I even understand that Protestant teaching outlawed contraception. Everybody was against it at one point, and they've relaxed their teachings on it. But how do you how can you explain? Well, you're outside. You're outside the kingdom of God, and I'm not. Or I am. I'm in the kingdom of God. Does that make sense, guys?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a great question. First of all, there's no moral double standard. All right. So morality, there's no such thing as Catholic morality and secular morality. There's only one morality. All right. And morality is not something. Moral law is not something that's imposed by authority. Like, it's not because the Catholic Church says so that something is wrong, so that it's only wrong for Catholics and okay for everybody else. Morality is derived from our nature as created by God. All right. Moral laws that lead us to happiness. All right. It's just a description of the kinds of behaviors that lead us to beatitude. Just like the fact that drug abuse is bad for you isn't something that's true just because the Catholic Church says so. It's inscribed into our very nature. The things that are harmful to the body, they're things that are intrinsically harmful to the psychology, to the mind, to the will, to our moral choices, that literally deform our actions, causing them to be objectively ugly and lead us to a deformed moral life that will ultimately take us to hell if we don't correct them in the light of divine teaching, natural law, grace, and all the rest of it. All right. The reason that Protestants sometimes reject elements of not just Catholic morality, but the patrimony of the human race is the devolution of reason within the Western Christian tradition. For 2,000 years, Christianity is unique in the world for the extent to which it upholds reason as a rule for human action, far more than anything in the Eastern world in Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or even in Judaism. Christianity has always held up the rule of reason. This is one of the reasons that things like science and technology emerged in medieval Catholic Europe and no place else in the world. It's why standards of justice and presumptions of innocence and rules of procedure and things like that evolved in the in the Western legal tradition in ways that they didn't evolve in other parts of the world. All right, and so the tremendous patrimony of moral reflection in the West evolved in large measure because of the Catholic Church's respect for reason. This is something that many Protestants carried with them for centuries, even after the Reformation. On paper, they acknowledged only the authority of sacred Scripture, but in practice, they maintained a lot of the moral convictions that they had received, from that much larger data set of moral reflection. In the 1930s, as you pointed out, the Episcopal Church bailed on some of those things. They opened the door just a crack, but it's led to an absolute floodgate of change, social change within Protestantism, and a much restricted view of the authority of sacred Scripture. So now many Protestants take the view that unless they find something explicitly spelled out in the Bible, then it must be lawful. All right, and so they tolerate a lot of immoral behaviors simply because they don't find them literally spelled out in the Bible. In the 19th century, we saw something analogous in the question of slavery, and there was a lot of moral reflection on slavery among Protestants in the South who said, hey, look, I don't find anything explicitly condemning slavery in the Bible, therefore it must be okay, right? And that argument was made explicitly. And the moral reflection on slavery obviously had to take into consideration a lot of things that were not explicitly scriptural, natural law, dignity of the human person, and so on and so forth. So I think, the best way to have this conversation with your friends and neighbors is to emphasize that point. The Catholic Church doesn't teach this as something that's just true for Catholics or true only because the Church defines it. This is inscribed into our very nature by God. So, for instance, there's a world of difference between contraceptive sex and sexuality within chaste marriage. The form, the intent of the human act is vastly different when you engage in procreative sex within the context of a lifelong indissoluble fellowship for the purpose of raising a family. Has a completely different structure and an entirely different meaning from sexuality that is aimed merely at either the gratification of a sexual urge or even for a kind of emotional intimacy devoid of that fecundity and life-giving intent that would totally change the intention and the action in pure chaste Christian wedlock.
George, thank you so much for your call. Hope that is helpful for you. I really wanted to get to the last two questions here. Joan in Kansas City talking about Alcoholics Anonymous, and Michael in Wisconsin had a question about once saved, always saved. How do I argue against it? A couple of great questions, and I'm hoping that both Michael and Joan will call in tomorrow, and we'll put you folks at the head of the line.
Fantastic.
Yeah, Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate it.
Coming up next, it's going to be EWTN Open Line. John Martinoni takes your calls on apologetics. Later tonight, Catholic Answers Live. Jason Everett talking chastity. Father Brian Milady on grace and nature. By the way, if you want more information on Mother Angelica of happy memory, visit EWTN.com. I'm Tom Price. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Call to Communion. Thanks. God bless.